Erin. Okay, yeah, so I currently am an organic crop consultant with the Rodale Institute. As consultants, we help farmers transition to organic in any way that they need support with. So I'm an agronomist by training, so this is definitely the place that I play a huge role in their transition process. But we also help with paperwork, filling, and any question that anyone might have about transition. So if you need any help, and we also support farmers that are already organic and want to improve their practices, try new practices. As Erin said, I was working with her for 5 years and did a lot of work on the organic no-till system. So if it's something you're interested in implementing on your farm, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to do one-on-one mentoring on how I think it would work best on your operation. I originally from France, so I think my accent has gotten better and my English has gotten more understandable to everybody's. But if there is an issue, you don't understand a word I say, feel free to make me repeat. I won't be offended. It's totally fine to make me repeat anything. Today, Erin asked me to talk about fertility management in organic systems. I wanted to preface the presentation by saying that I'm not a soil scientist, and I think it was a great talk that Vereecke just gave. And he's, a microbial ecologist, works a lot with soils. I'm an agronomist, so I'm jack of all trades, I guess, in agronomy. I'm not a specialist in any specific area of agronomy outside of organic. But still, I wanted to present some, soil dynamics and such topic information in this slide, so hopefully I still give it a fair shot. So why are we talking about, I wanted to move around, but the microphone doesn't work really well, so I guess I'm gonna have to stick here. Limiting factor in agricultural production. Why are we talking about crop fertility? Well, because it happens to be one of the 3 main limiting factors in agriculture in general, along with water and weed pressure. So here we can see in organic grain production, weeds are one of the major limiting factor, along with crop nitrogen deficiency, given that nitrogen supply is frequently the second most limiting factor after water availability. Low nitrogen availability in soil is often the major nutrient limiting factor for plant growth and yield. So not only just nutrient, but really specifically nitrogen is oftentimes one of the biggest limiting factor, particularly in organic systems where the way to bring nitrogen to the farm is a lot more limited than just bringing mineral nitrogen to your farm in a conventional system. Phosphorus and potassium are obviously very important as well as other macro and micronutrients, but I might focus a little bit more on nitrogen here than on those others. First, I wanted to ask all of you, who is already an organic farmer? All right. Who is transitioning to organic or interested in transitioning to organic? Okay, so I might just be talking just to you. All of the information that I'm giving is going to be, very basic, which I think is always great to rehash the basics of how to build a nutrient management plan, how to look at your soil test, how to think about your crop rotation in regard to nutrient management, and how to use animal manures. So let's get started. What is my soil test telling me? A lot of things. And I get a lot of farmers giving me this type of soil test with those beautiful colors and those little things that's giving you your score, and it's just very overwhelming, and I even sometimes can't wrap my head around it. So if a grower is asking me, what is this telling me? Sometimes I'm like, I don't know, maybe too many things, maybe things you can't understand. So let's dig into it, and let's dig into what I think is the most important numbers that are coming back to you in your soil test. The basics. Those to me are the basics. Of course, the other ones can be important, but always start with those. Organic matter, phosphorus, potassium, calcium and magnesium to some extent, and I will explain that in detail. pH, the buffer pH, and the CEC. Those are the most important metrics in your soil test, and you really need to understand what they're telling you in order to build a solid nutrient management plan. We're going to go through them one by one, with for some of them going a little deeper in what they mean and how to interpret them. Organic matter, extremely important. And I just wanted to also say that this is an actual soil test that a farmer shared with me He wanted some advice on how to improve his system. Some of the metrics here are really out of whack, and we will cover that, and that's specifically why I chose that specific soil test. So why is organic matter important? Organic matter can bring you quite a lot of things, including nitrogen. It can be a great source of nitrogen in your system, so building it and knowing how much you have in terms of organic matter, very important in order to determine how much nitrogen to apply to your system. This is just one of the many tables that are available on extension services websites that shows you, depending on your soil organic matter tests, how much nitrogen you can expect to get to your crop. So roughly what you're seeing here is 20 pounds per percent of organic matter. Some of them don't show exactly those numbers, and I think the reason is that the science behind it is not super exact, which I think is going to be a thing that I will repeat a lot today, is that a lot of the science between manure, cover crop, organic matter, release of nutrients is not exact and vary deeply depending on the soil type and on the weather. But this here is a graph that I wanted to share because I think it gives a lot of great information. So this is research that was carried out by Charlie White at Penn State University. I think he's a great soil scientist and works a lot on nutrient cycling. We also have another great scientist here, Matt Ruark, who I talk to both of them quite often when I have specific questions. So let's dig into this specific graphs here. I wanted to get close to it. Okay. Maybe I can hold this microphone in my hand. Do you hear me okay? Yeah, it's working. All right, so on this side, you can see the correlation between observed grain yield and predicted grain yield. And the predicted grain yield, they actually modeled it using a soil carbon model. So they were thinking, how do we predict how much organic matter is going to come, or how much nitrogen is going to come from our organic matter to feed our crop? And they thought, all right, let's look at soil carbon. Soil carbon, maybe you measure it and you can have a good idea of how much nitrogen you can get from your organic matter. And they tested something else, which is the CO2 respiration. You're probably all familiar with it. This is basically how the microbes are respiring, emitting carbon dioxide as they are decomposing the organic matter. So they thought, all right, let's look at those two indicators that are easily measurable in the fields, and let's try to understand which one can we get from a soil test and better predict how much nitrogen is going to be available to the crop, so how much impact it's going to have on your crop growth. And both of them are actually pretty good. So the line in the center, the closest the points would be, the better predictor would the soil measured carbon or carbon dioxide would be a greater measure of the yield. So you can see that the soil carbon model, the dots are a little tighter to the line, which means that measuring soil carbon in your soil is a little bit better of an indicator of how much nitrogen is going to be available to your crop and how much you're going to see a yield advantage in having that organic matter in your soil. But CO2 is also not as bad, and having a conversation with Charlie, who conducted that research, he feels pretty confident that CO2 respiration is actually a pretty good way to quickly measure in your soil how much it's going to benefit your crops. So we can go back to that very confusing, lots of color, very funny, very entertaining soil test, and dig a little bit into it. So you can see that on that soil test, the CO2 respiration was indicated. Solvita is one of the CO2 respiration tools that has been used quite a lot and advertised quite a lot about to farmers. And so in talking to Charlie about his model on CO2 respiration and the prediction on nitrogen released from the organic matter, knowing that CO2 respiration, he told me that in Pennsylvania, and I want to insist on that, specific weather, specific soil type, any data that you see that anyone presents you is in their specific context. So you can't really take the number and bring it exactly back to your farm, but it gives you a good estimate of what you will see on your own farm. In Pennsylvania, for every unit of CO2 respiration, they gain 1.45 bushel per acre of corn in an unfertilized soil. So pretty good measure, pretty good correlation here between soil type and between carbon respiration and yield advantage. So if you multiply the carbon respiration that you see here, 42.7, by that 1.45 factor, if you do not fertilize this specific soil, you will get 61 bushels of corn. Pretty good, just from your organic matter. Then you would have to add the rest in order to get whatever yield you're aiming for. So I just wanted to look at this soil test again, because so this is at the end the CO2 respiration here is a pretty good estimation of your nitrogen available. It was ranked medium to low, and then they had the nitrogen N supply of 98 pounds per acre. This number here is not really reliable. Nitrogen comes and goes depending again on the weather, on the time of the year you're sampling. I would absolutely not make a recommendation out of this specific number. I think the CO2 respiration and using this factor, and hopefully they can calibrate it to different weather and different soils, is a much better indication of how much your organic matter can bring to your crop in terms of nitrogen. Any question? This was a little bit nerdy, but I hope you got something out of it. So moving on to phosphorus, if no question. Either you're very confused or you really got it really good. Hopefully the later. Phosphorus, also very important. So most of the time in the Midwest, you will see your Bray P1 and your Bray P2. The P1 is the one that's readily available to your crop right now. The P2 will be available sometime, who knows when. A lot of that in organic, unfortunately. How do you interpret your soil test? If you have a low phosphorus soil test, your soil is limiting, your crop is going to have issues growing properly on such a low soil test. If it's medium, you just need to apply for crop removal to keep your levels where they are. You don't need to increase the levels. In the low level, you really need to work on increasing that level in order to get to medium eventually, so every year you only have to bring what your crop will take out. High and excessive, there is absolutely no need to apply phosphorus. I know you come from different regions, and some of the soils in the US are rich in phosphorus, some of them are very poor in phosphorus, so look at your own soil test. What does it mean to apply it to the removal? This data, and you will see, I'm putting all the sources, and I'm always happy to share the slides. A lot of those sources are from extension. And just look at your state's extension website. That data is usually better calibrated to your type of soil in your area. So this is from Penn State, and it's showing how much units of phosphorus each crop is taking per bushel or per ton of it. So this is what you would want to add if your soil test was medium. And you can see, corn, 80, alfalfa, 75, and so on. Those are really the information. I'm just walking you through. I got my soil test. What do? Potassium. And here I'm putting the CEC because the clay particle and the organic matter have an impact on the CEC. And the higher the clay content of your soil, the higher the risk of your soil holding on to that potassium. So depending on your soil type, that potassium might be there, but it might not be available because the clay particles, again, are just holding on to that potassium. So very important to look at your CEC and look at your optimum range of potassium in your soil is going to differ widely depending on your CEC. Cation exchange capacity. I never say what the acronym means, but I think you're pretty all familiar with it. So you can see from the soil test that I gathered here, his CEC is 7 on some fields, 12 to 13 on other fields, which means the optimum range is going to range from 65 to 110 in his low CEC fields, 125 to 200 on his higher CEC fields. Pretty good difference here. And depending on how his soil test, again, is going to look like, he's going to have to apply more or less potassium. If he's in the optimum range, again, he's usually going to have to apply only potassium to the crop removal, which again, look for your local extension service, data on it. But this is, this is from Penn State, but because it's just crop dependent, you can use that data on your own farm. So this is how much potassium is going to be removed by the crop if the crop yields that amount. And this means this is the amount of potassium you need to apply if you are in an optimum range. If you're below that, again, you're going to have, like the phosphorus, you're going to have to work on building up that potassium on the long term. Next indicator, the pH and the buffer capacity. Different crops have different pH range that they prefer to be in. You can see that alfalfa is usually the highest. I don't think that's any news for anyone, but really great to remind ourselves of that. And then soybeans a little bit below that. On average, most crops like to be in the 6 pH range. If your soil is not there, you're going to have to fix that. This is the first thing you have to fix, because if your pH is not in the right range, there might be nutrient in your soil, but they won't be available to your crop. You can see here between 6 and 7, this is when most of the nutrients are available for your crop to uptake. If you go too low, you're losing a lot of your macro, and a lot of your macro. If you go too high, you're losing a lot of your micronutrient, iron, manganese, boron, copper, zinc. So really important to fix your pH. Again, if you read your soil test, I think that would be the first thing, if it's out of whack, to fix it. And finally, I'm not going to go deep into that, but sulfur, which is another macronutrient, and the other micronutrients, you can also read that on your soil test, and that's really going to be crop specific. Some crops tend to be limited by some other micro or micronutrients. You can see, like, for example, zinc can be limiting for corn, so if you have low zinc and you want to grow corn, you might need to amend your soil. Same, alfalfa might be limited by sulfur, and so on. I am done with this reading your soil test part. Is there any question on it? I know you've all done it, but I think it's great to rehash that and cover our bases here. No question, you're all experts at reading your soil test? Wow, impressive. Yes?
Cation exchange capacity, as it relates, I mean, is that a direct relation to the carbon in your soil? I mean, did you buy your CEC when you bought the land, or how are you able to manipulate?
So the CEC is tied to clay and organic matter. Those are the main influencers of your cation exchange capacity. Obviously, the clay content of your soil, you can't manipulate it because this is your soil texture, but organic matter is kind of your only way to play with cation exchange capacity and potentially increase it.
You would be able to see an increase?
You would be able, yeah, if you see an increase in organic matter, you will see an increase in cation exchange capacity. You can bring a lot of clay to your fields, which will be a little bit weird,
well,
but
I have plenty already.
You have plenty already? Okay. It's good and bad. You know, it holds on to the nutrients, but sometimes it holds on to them a little too much, as you probably know already. No more question? Yes, Paul? Oh, that's going to be a hard one. I'm scared.
With the optimum pH, not every crop is the same.
Yes.
Which should we, if I'm growing corn and alfalfa, should I be, is the corn more unhappy at 6.8 than the alfalfa is at 6.4?
That's a very great question, and I don't have the answer to it.
You should adjust your pH for the most sensitive.
Greg, I don't know if people can.
Sorry.
No, go for it, please.
You should always adjust or lime for your most pH-sensitive crop, and in that case, it's alfalfa. So you should be going for that 6.87, and the corn's going to be fine.
So, yeah, corn is not going to be too unhappy at the high pH. Okay.
But oh yeah, alfalfa is not happy.
Yeah. Alpha is not happy with low pH. Yeah. Any more questions?
Jared?
Yeah.
I know you can give a tutorial on how to raise a pH. For 2 decades of testing, every one of mine starts with a 7. Do I just spread elemental sulfur everywhere, or when you're organic and you can't use those wonderful salt-based fertilizers right away?
That's kind of your only option, yeah. Maybe Greg has a better answer to that. How do you lower your pH, Greg? outside of applying elemental sulfur everywhere?
Stop farming organically. Start putting down a lot of nitrogen and just grow
Whoa,
corn
Greg,
for
out of
organic.
here! Get out of
Okay,
here!
I'm just joking.
Pull him
I'm
out!
just joking. I have no answer.
So you've tried to do it, to lower it or not? Okay. And is your corn unhappy at your 7 pH or?
I don't think my limiting factor is pH.
Okay.
It's probably potassium and sulfur.
Okay. Yeah, it's all about the balance of the limiting factors and which one is the greatest here, yeah. And sometimes it's water and there is nothing you can do about it most of the time. Great, so let's go through a rotation, again, same soil test, and looking at how much of what do we need to add if we got to the soil test and we were going to do our corn, soybean, wheat rotation. So I put the nutrient removal / uptake for the nitrogen of corn, wheat, soybean, corn for 200 bushel, winter wheat for 60 bushel, and soybean for 50 bushel. So let's start with the corn. How am I going to feed my corn to get 200 bushel? First of all, I had red clover before it. Great. Oh, I didn't put the organic matter. I had organic matter. So we have 4% organic matter. We say it's roughly 20. Okay. It's roughly 20 pounds of nitrogen per % organic matter. So we add that. We take that off our 200. We get to 120. So after we've used the credit from our organic matter, we're going to use the credit from our clover. We can see here there's a range between 30 and 60 pounds of available nitrogen. Available, very important term. There is a lot of total nitrogen in that clover, but not all of it is going to be available right away. So we take those 30 to 60 pounds off that 120. How much do we still need? We still need 80 pounds of nitrogen to get our, oh sorry, I didn't fix that slide, 200. I was in Ohio and I think their yields are a little lower, so I gave 150 bushel acre corn in Ohio and I'm giving 200 here. I hope it's accurate. You guys can grow 200 bushel of corn, can't you? Yeah, okay.
We can grow 200 bushel in Ohio too, just so you know.
Oops, they came all the way here. Okay. Well, this is your recipe to grow 200 bushel, so good for you. Thanks for coming and correcting me. So, okay, so this is for 200, not 150, so we're down to 80 pounds. I didn't take any credit for phosphorus and potassium from the cover crop because this is even fuzzier than it is for nitrogen. So I'm considering we got nothing from our cover crop, and here we're trying to add manure. And we're also trying not to destroy the environment, which would be really great, and also not to destroy our soils. So if we have liquid dairy manure, and you can see in blue is when we're hitting our needs for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. I guess you don't see my pointer. Now you see it. Yes. So 80 pounds of nitrogen from our liquid dairy manure. This is a mix of different tests that I got from different growers. Tests on manure can vary a lot. We will talk about it later. So 80 pounds of nitrogen from our dairy manure brings us not quite enough phosphorus, but here I'm not too worried about phosphorus in general. It brings us a lot of potassium. So potassium doesn't have the environmental impact that phosphorus has. You know, phosphorus really known to pollute bodies of water, be terrible for algae blooms and so on. Potassium, the negative effect of potassium are a little more fuzzy, and it's more about your soil. So potassium will take spots on your cation exchange capacity that are then not going to be available for other nutrients. So that would be the risk of having too much potassium in your soil, is that then some other nutrients will not be available because potassium is just taking all the room. So dairy manure, not too bad. If you think that you probably have alfalfa in your rotation, which exports a lot of potassium, then it's good, you're going to export it anyway. So it looks like dairy for dairy farm works pretty good. That's nice. So hog manure here. To get enough nitrogen, 80 pounds. Again, we're not going to get enough phosphorus. We're going to get too much potassium. Chicken, which a lot of people use because it's the one that's the most available. I know some in Illinois, Indiana, a lot of people use chicken manure, mostly pelletized. This is not pelletized. This is just raw chicken manure. And the numbers here are a little bit more worrisome. If we wanted to get our 200 bushel corn and add our 80 pounds of nitrogen, we're going to add way too much phosphorus. And that's where the impact is really not great on the environment. What do we need to do? We need to build organic matter, have more cover crop, keep that clover a lot longer in order to have more nitrogen available for our corn so we don't have to fertilize with manure as much. Now we're going to our winter wheat. I had, the winter wheat needed 70 pounds of nitrogen. I took the organic matter off of it, 10 pounds are left. There is some nitrogen available to the wheat from the clover. Penn State Extension estimates 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of soybean, sorry. So here, we don't need to add anything to our wheat in terms of nitrogen. I know with wheat in terms of getting enough protein, if you're on the food market, it's a little bit more complicated of a story, but overall, you're not gonna need more nitrogen for your wheat in that rotation with that clover as a cover crop here. Any question, comment, objection? Greg, you said you were gonna roast me. I'm waiting. Okay. Don't wait, come on, do it now.
Paul has another question.
With your manure for corn, you were getting too much phosphorus. In a moderate or low soil test level, is that an environmental concern when followed with a legume crop that, like your chicken litter?
Yeah,
We've got extra P and K for the corn.
yes,
I plant soybeans next.
Yes.
I don't fertilize the soybeans. Was that an environmental issue, or I just pre-fertilized my soybean seed?
yeah, I think now you're talking about the long-lasting effect of manure, and it does have the potential to build up your phosphorus and potassium in your soil, definitely. If it's here, it might build up over the years, and I think I have slides on it. I read so many papers that I don't know which one I put in my slides, but I can share with you a great study that was conducted in Canada with rotation like that was using hog manure and building up their phosphorus and potassium, and you can see the long-lasting effect. Over 10 years, the soil is still very loaded in phosphorus and potassium. So I think you're still gonna potentially have that, especially with the phosphorus, that detrimental impact. And you can see the needs of the soybeans here. 50 pounds of phosphorus is not a lot either.
Greg had a follow-up.
Yeah,
I just wanted to follow up to make sure that the principal environmental impact with phosphorus in this part of the world is eutrophication and freshwater ecosystems, and that is because phosphorus is a limiting resource. And so when phosphorus gets into our lakes, in this part of the world, freshwater lakes, we get algal blooms which kill fish, et cetera, et cetera. And most of the phosphorus that we lose from agricultural systems is lost in particulate matter. So, we do lose some to percolation through the soil, but the vast majority of it, if we can keep our soil in place, those phosphorus levels in our soil aren't quite as big of an issue. It's when we start losing soil through erosion or...
so if you're building your phosphorus in your soil, just make sure your soil stays where it should be. So do no-till, I guess.
Ideally, I mean, it's not like nitrogen that it's going to be a groundwater
Yes.
contaminant. There's the risk is like Greg and you're saying, it's the soil, particulate organic, moving off the field. So
Yeah.
not to say that it's not something we shouldn't manage, but just understanding kind of where the risk points are and kind of mitigate that.
Thanks for the clarification, Greg.
Can't you remove your hay and your straw and get rid of some of your phosphorus levels?
Yeah, I mean, alfalfa exports a lot of potassium mainly. It does export phosphorus as well. Did I have the numbers? I did probably. You can see alfalfa exports quite a lot of potassium and phosphorus, 75 pounds per acre of alfalfa. So you're going to export some of it with your alfalfa. Alfalfa is amazing, and I will say it many times in this presentation. Okay, so we're done going around a rotation. Any other question on this one?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yes.
So if you're putting down chicken manure and
coming next. And I don't have all the answers, but I can give you some of the answers here. So why do we want to build our soil health? I think that was pretty well presented here. If you build your soil health, you're going to have more soil organic matter. That means you're going to have more naturally available nitrogen. You don't need to use that much manure. And I really liked how this person put it. Organic matter is linked to important functions in the soil and is critical to maximizing biological activity within the soil. Along with clay particles, it provides cation exchange sites in the soil, reducing nutrient leaching losses. Microorganisms using organic matter as a food source promote aggregation of soil particles, resulting in improved structure, soil water infiltration, and holding capacity. It reduces the potential for runoff and erosion as well. Higher organic matter levels also result in favorable soil temperature, improved plants, root growth, healthy microbial population, and moderate pH range. It's amazing. Just get some more organic matter. So how do we build our soil health? And again, alfalfa. So every time I prepare a presentation, I read the entire body of scientific literature that's available to me. I spend way too much time doing it. And then I kind of try to distill it to something that's presentable, I guess. And if you look at all of it, alfalfa is the main driver for improved soil health in a lot of long-term cropping system trials. Greg, are you going to contradict me on this one? No? Leave it. Oh, he has so many opinions about it. Increased soil organic carbon and higher soil biological activity will be provided by alfalfa in your rotation. Greater numbers of water-stable aggregates. And this is not just from one study, again, it's from multiple studies, long-term sites that have side-by-side comparisons of different systems. Cover crops are also really great for building your soil health. They're crops that are not harvested, but produced to enrich the soil and capture inorganic nitrogen. They do have the potential to increase soil organic carbon. And we know that tillage does influence soil organic carbon as well, and soil health more broadly. So what it means here is crop rotation is your main tool for nutrient building. Because with thinking about your crop rotation, you're going to be able to maybe have alfalfa in it, maybe have more cover crops, maybe reduce your tillage through crop rotation. We've talked a lot about reducing tillage on a specific phase of the rotation. No-till soybeans, no-till corn, no-till small grains. But it's kind of hard to put them all next to each other. If you think, I was thinking a lot about it during Matt's presentation, having no-till corn in your rotation is already pretty complicated because you have to plant your rye on time to have enough biomass, which means you can't have corn before it really. And then if you're thinking about no-till corn, you have to plant veg. And veg, you have to plant it in August. So how many short season crops do you have to have in your rotation in order to have just no-till? So it seems to me that no-till all the way every year is just a little bit hard to achieve. So we really want to think about, in a 10-year phase, how many times do I have to do heavy tillage? How many times am I having to turn my soil? And try to reduce that over a longer period of time than just 12 months. So through crop rotation, we can achieve that. This is just to say crop rotation is just not a new tool. It's actually pretty old. And here are some ideas of how we can improve our soil organic matter, improve the nitrogen that's provided by our soil by increasing our crop rotation. And the amount of nitrogen supplied by a forage legume depends on the length of time that it has to grow in your field. So having a medium red clover after your wheat and then killing it before the winter is going to provide you much less nitrogen than if you leave the clover for an entire year. And it's going to have much less soil building capacity as well, not only just the nitrogen effect. So you can see here we have a 4-year rotation. We've already extended from our 3-year. We have a full year of clover, and I know it can be complicated in terms of economic to make that work, to have an entire year where the clover is growing. If you have a market, you can sell it for forage. And then we go to that 8-year rotation, which has more crops. So it has oats and alfalfa in addition to the corn, wheat, and soybeans. That kind of opens up the room for those cover crop phases. The more small grain you're able to have in your rotation and market, the more you're going to be able to grow cover crop. We all know that growing cover crop after corn or soybeans is very complicated. You have a very short window of time, and it's always better to have a cover crop than to have nothing. I'm all into planting rye at any time after corn and soybean harvest. Doesn't matter if it's December, January, February. Having a little bit of a living root in the soil is always better than nothing. But I'm talking, having large amounts of green manure cover crop grown in your field is really only possible after a small grain. And we've heard and had questions about multi-cropping, especially double cropping and relay cropping. So multi-cropping is kind of a sub-term that just means you're using your land for two different things at the same time. So double cropping, you're using your land to produce two crops in the same year. And you have the give and take balance here. And I think in a double cropping system, it's just taking and taking. You're not giving anything back. And again, you're going to be double cropping if you have your corn, soybean, wheat rotation in the phase in which you would have the best opportunity to grow a very valuable cover crop, which is why I think double cropping, it sounds really great this year in my bottom line, but in 10 years, I might regret it because I didn't use the phase I had to build my soil with a very lush, big cover crop. And I don't think I'm the only one who thinks that. This is a quote from a USDA publication. Although double cropping has the potential to limit the environmental consequences associated with cropland expansion, such as increased soil erosion and loss of wildlife habitat or carbon sinks, as U.S. farmers increase production to meet growing global demand, it also may introduce negative environmental consequences of its own. There's a lot of talking about it, and I think I'm going to be the voice that's against it and trying to convince farmers to, if they can afford not to double crop, then they shouldn't do it, and think about the longer term instead. Going back to our alfalfa, this is a pretty old publication from UW Extension, and I just really liked the little picture here, and I'm not sure if anyone who's working in this at the moment would still agree. It states that in a mature stand of alfalfa, there's 40 to 60% of the nitrogen in the above ground plants and 40 to 60% in the roots. So that's kind of a lot, and I know that a lot of studies don't look at the roots very much, and some numbers that I will show after don't show such high numbers in the roots. But here you can see the nitrogen, the nitrate that's available the year after alfalfa in several research stations in Wisconsin. Arlington is the one where Erin conducts most of her research. You can see a huge benefit here of alfalfa on the corn. You can have almost 180 pounds of nitrogen available the following year. So just grow alfalfa, it's amazing. I know it's hard to market. How much time do I have, Erin? Do you know? Okay. So going into cover crop, we were talking about, how to improve soil health. There was alfalfa, cover crop, tillage. We covered alfalfa. Again, it's pretty good. I can't say enough how good alfalfa is in a rotation. But cover crops are also pretty great. You see they can provide quite a bunch of nitrogen in the first year, and they can also release residual nitrogen for up to 3 years. And that's not well measured. How long and how much every year after the first year is going to be available from cover crop, from manure, is not super well dialed down, as far as I've seen in the literature. And one of the big things that we want to think about with cover crops and with manure is the synchrony of the nitrogen availability compared to the highest nitrogen need of our crop. So here you can see the curve for the nitrogen needs of the corn. And you can see that here between V6 and V18, so that's here you have June, July, so mid-June to mid-July is when the corn needs the most nitrogen. If you're using alfalfa or another cover crop to bring nitrogen to your corn, is the nitrogen going to be available here? Is it going to be available here, here, or a little bit of all of them? Well, that's complicated. So let's look at a lot of very fancy graphs from papers that have studied that. Most of the data that I will show now has been done in the lab. So it was not in the field. They were looking at the nitrogen release of those cover crops in a lab setting, but they tried to mimic a field as much as they could. So I think it's still valuable information, but not exactly reflective of what you would see in your fields. Carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to be pretty important in when your nitrogen is going to be available for your crop. So you can see here the C/N ratio is increasing from 5 to more than 50. And I don't know, how can you read the green part? Good? Okay, cool. So you can see that depending on the crop material that you're integrating and also the stage at which you're integrating it in the soil, the carbon to nitrogen ratio will vary quite a lot. It's kind of hard to predict because it will also depend on the year and your soil, but it's a good information to have and maybe collect repeatedly on your farm to kind of have an idea of which cover crop you're consistently growing gets to which carbon to nitrogen ratio at the time at which you're terminating it. And again, Charlie White here, a really fun tool if you want to play around and try to understand the dynamics of nitrogen in your soil according to cover crop, to your soil type, your organic matter. You can go to this tool. It's called the Graphical Interface to Determine Cover Crop and Soil Organic Matter Nitrogen Credit. I'm not going to go in details into it, and it really says here that it's really for education purposes. Do not take the numbers that you see here as a total recommendation. But it's for you to just, if you move the needles here in how much yield you're expecting to have, what biomass of cover crop you have, how much clay do you have in your soil, then you will see those two bars of how much would be the non-fertilized yield of your corn. So I think it's good to help wrap your head around what's going on in the soil and how it's affecting the nitrogen release for your crop. So going into those graphs that I said were done in lab and we're showing the nitrogen release of different types of plant material. I can't remember the number, but I think they collected more than 200 types of plants, and they looked at the release of nitrogen or the immobilization. So mineralization is the release of nitrogen. Immobilization is when your soil or your organic input is holding on to that nitrogen, making it unavailable to your crop. Here it's sorted in 3 different graphs, depending on the neutral detergent soluble nitrogen, pretty fancy term that I don't understand the exact definition of, but it means the plant material that will be, it's mostly what builds off the cell of the plants. So it's your cellulose, your lignin, your whole cellulose, and all of that. And they found it as a pretty good factor to determine how well your nitrogen will be mineralized or immobilized if you put it in your soil. And it also is a little bit correlated here with the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Here you can see the carbon to nitrogen ratio is 128, and we saw previously that you have to be around 10, 15 in order to have nitrogen mineralization over nitrogen immobilization. So not surprisingly, as you increase your carbon to nitrogen ratio, as you increase it going this way, you decrease your mineralization, which would be above the red line, and it's all immobilization. So anything that's below the red line here shows that your organic material is taking away the nitrogen from your soil and it's thus not available for your crop. Here, carbon to nitrogen ratio decreases a little bit. You can see this is Phacelia and green leaves input. It's a pretty nice curve, and you see the day from the start of incubation. So they were putting the Phacelia in the soil, and you can see it really releases the nitrogen quite quickly, and it plateaus after 50 days. So that means you're putting your cover crop in your soil. After 50 days, in this case, it's pretty much done releasing nitrogen. So it's pretty quick. And sometimes we're terminating our cover crop in the fall prior to planting our crop. It's sitting there all winter, not a lot happening in the winter, or grounds are frozen. But once the ground starts thawing and gets a good temperature, the nitrogen from your cover crop is being released way before that phase when your corn, for example, needs a lot of nitrogen. So synchrony and green manure can be a big problem. You can see here, even lower C/N ratio, it's even quicker to release, and as you go lower, it's going to get quicker. Another study here that shows the difference between the shoots, so the above ground biomass of the cover crop, and the roots, the below ground biomass of the cover crop, and how much it's mineralizing in total, how much of that mineralization is coming, so the 15N is a marker that's been put in the cover crops. So all that you see in this is coming either from the shoot or the root of the cover crop. The bottom here is from the soil itself, and the top graph is the total. So if we start with the middle one, and the cover crops here that you see, there is clover, there is winter vetch. The clover is this line. The winter vetch is this one above. And at the bottom here, that are next to each other, there is forage radish and grass, which I think was ryegrass in this case. So second graph, again, you can see that the mineralization of just the cover crop is above zero. There is mineralization happening for all of them, including the grasses. But you here again can see that it starts to peak here around 20, 30 days after incorporation of the cover crop. So again, a pretty quick turnaround of that nitrogen from your cover crop. Similar from the rooting systems. And here it's the net mineralization from the soil nitrogen. So in order to release nitrogen from your cover crop, your microbes are using nitrogen from your soil. So they're eating the carbon, they're decomposing your cover crop by using the soil nitrogen as energy. So you can see the mineralization, and if it's lower again than the red bar, it's actually immobilization. So you can see a lot of immobilization of your soil nitrogen. Then you saw, you had calculated everything before, 20 pounds per person of organic matter, and then you put your cover crop in, and your cover crop is just eating all your nitrogen from your soil. Well, not all of it, because this is, again, the total balance between those two things here. So you can see that with the grass, there is a little bit of an immobilization for the first 40 days after incorporation of the grass, but then you have release after that. For the legumes, again, within the first 20 days, you have a lot of release of nitrogen, and after that, not so much anymore. How much time do you have, Erin?
10 more minutes.
Okay. Any question on those dynamics? Yes?
I'm wondering about the mineralization versus immobilization of like manures. It's something I kind of think about a lot. Like I try to do a lot of composting.
Yeah.
If I'm taking barn packs straight out of the barn into the field, does that need to be in the fall? So it's because the spectrum is like how broken down is
Yeah.
X when you apply it.
Yes, correct.
You just spread straw out versus 6 months of composting. How do you kind of determine if manure is broken down enough to apply where it's not going to rob from your crop? Because sometimes it can get anaerobic in a barn.
Yeah.
Composting is ideal, but that's not always practical.
I
Can you
don't
repeat
have.
that question?
Yeah. Oh, so immobilization from manure application. So most of the time, manure has so much available nitrogen that I'm not too concerned about immobilization, but I would love to hear another expert's or an expert's opinion on that,
Right.
if anyone has.
Do you have any thoughts, or anyone, in terms of thoughts on that?
Margaret.
Margaret, let me give you the mic, Margaret.
It really just depends on the amount of bedding in the manure, how much straw. And so if we've got liquid manure, we pretty much know it's available. But depending on the straw and how it affects the carbon to nitrogen ratio, I think everybody should, send that manure to the lab, and besides getting the analysis,
Yeah.
get this carbon to
I'm getting
nitrogen
there.
ratio.
I'm going to cover manure a little bit more, but I think the part that I can't answer is is there a risk for immobilization of nitrogen from manure application if it's like a long composted manure? And I think it probably comes down to your carbon to nitrogen ratio in that manure, but I don't have. Hopefully, someone has an answer.
Answer, Rod, or question?
No, I'm just making the question more complicated, actually. I was just worrying about composting and forming of amino acids out of that nitrogen.
No, you're roasting me. No, I have no idea.
Okay.
Erin? Greg? Margaret? All right, let's go on the manure and then we can...
Mark had a question first.
Okay.
I don't know if you can go back to your graph that shows nitrogen use efficiency in corn, but I think what's often missed is by, V5, V6, we've formed a lot of the ear in that plant already. And yes, you're not at the steep part of the curve, but you have locked in a certain portion of your yield potential. And that's where no-till organic corn has been so frustrating
Yes.
for me, and I've had to rely on, which a lot of people in this group maybe don't like this product, but Chilean nitrate, and put it immediately by the row, to get that rapid development and never let that corn plant think it's having a bad day in developing that ear. Now I realize the total for the year is going to be great, but if you've stubbed your toe at the beginning, you're never going to recover from that.
Definitely,
And
yes.
it seems like that's what happens in these no-till situations, and phase 2 of that, by the way, isn't necessarily about yield. It's about weed control. If I can bias that crop and get it 2-3 inches taller than my weeds, I've won. So I guess that's why sometimes I look at these inorganic forms being available immediately as being a good thing. And we're not talking a lot of products. 60 pounds is 9.7 units of N, right? It's less than 10 units of N. Conventional growers, misapply by way more than that, right? So I guess any thoughts on that whole thing? And
Yeah, I think it's more a comment than a question. It's a great comment that...
It's a great comment,
Yeah. Corn does need nitrogen at the beginning to get established, and if it's not established properly, then it's going to be a huge problem as well. Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps some type of pop-up fertilizers that are organically approved that sometimes contain Chilean nitrate. There are also products that are made of soybean hydrolysates, so it's just nitrogen from soybeans. If you don't want to use Chilean nitrate, could be an alternative as like a pop-up fertilizer. I agree that establishment is key, not only for nutrients, but also for weed control.
But if that takes a lot of biology to get going, you maybe will miss that window again. So that's the problem, relying on biology to make the release.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're spot on, Margaret. This is
Yeah.
really getting to the challenge of trying
Yeah.
to understand how to what all these balances in these systems and what is the best way
Yeah.
to kind of...
But those soybean hydrolyzate products are readily available, just like Chilean nitrate. Yes.
Just to comment on that, I really recommend putting a squeeze pump on your corn
Let
plant.
me give you that.
Squeeze pump on your corn planter.
We mess with different liquid mixes to put in the furrow.
Wait for Erin.
So we've tried several different mixes. So in furrow, while you're planting, a squeeze pump, 200-gallon tank, like a liquid fish mixture, and then depending on your soil test, some micronutrients will be approved to add into, but like a biological stimulant, our brand is called MVP, mixed with a liquid fish mixture, can give a lot. I mean, soybeans we've noticed pop 3 or 4 days earlier, and can help corn get that early growth faster with a little bit of that stimulation that's immediately available as the plant is germinating. So I don't know how long that lasts, but it gives you a good start. We've noticed generally like a 10 bushel bump with an in-furrow starter like that.
Thank you. And I purposefully didn't talk about anything that's readily available in nitrogen. I like to go the hard route and talk about the hard routes, and this is, building your soil. Your manure, your cover crops are good building your soil on the long term, but obviously there is room for those more readily available forms of nitrogen, which I purposefully decided not to cover today. So the role of manure, we haven't talked about it too much.
We
Hopefully,
have 5 more minutes.
5 minutes.
So.
Okay, I'm gonna make it really quick. So we know all the benefits of manure. Talking about first year availability, so this is, I think it's getting pretty old, and I wish UW-Madison was updating this manure fast fact. I'm not looking at anyone in particular here, but I kind of am. It's really good. I like, it's like a little pamphlet, and it has everything on it. It has the nitrogen from alfalfa, from cover crop, and it has this from manure. And I think the point that I want to make here is that do not use those numbers. Test your own manure. Those are a great indicator, but what's important here is what they have on top, is the time to incorporation. So they have less than 3 days, 1 to 3 days, and less than 1 hour. And in some instances, you see liquid manure, you're losing a lot of nitrogen if you're not working it in. So here, best management practices, look at this kind of information and make sure you're using the best practices not to lose any of the nitrogen that you used a lot of money and time to apply into your fields. I don't have it with me. It's really available online, but if you need that publication, just let me know. I can find it for you. And you were talking about the first year availability versus the second year availability and so on and so forth. And I think that's a little bit foggy. And again, sample your manure. Any manure that you're using, if you're buying it, ask for the specific sample of that specific manure to make sure you're applying what you need, no more, no less. And look at this first year availability. The total nitrogen is a great thing to know. It's going to be available eventually, but the first year availability is the most important thing. And most labs now have this on their results, but if you don't have it, like this test that's a little older, there are good, again, extension publications that show estimate the first year availability of manure in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, depending on what type of manure you're using. So it's a percentage of the total that's indicated on your soil test, on your manure test. And as far as it doesn't answer the immobilization from manure, but I think, so this is a study from Canada, the Quebec region of Canada. I'm looking at my notes in French here, so my brain is a little bit messed up. But so the corn yield in bushel per acre, depending on when you're applying that manure. Beef, pre-plant, swine, pre-plant, and swine post-emergence. And it's again all about that synchrony. And the reason why the swine post-emergence gave better yields than the pre-applications here is again the synchrony of the nitrogen availability. The bulk of the nitrogen here was available during that phase when the corn needs it the most. So synchrony is important for green manure, but also a good thing to think about was animal manure. And I know that I'm kind of asking an impossible thing here for most manures to apply it post-emergence, because it's impossible to do it, and it's impossible to do the mechanical weeding you need to do. So that's why I'm thinking that Matt and Erin should be working on new ways to add fertilizers to your rotation. And it's the cut and carry method that I was not familiar with. Apparently it's a very common method in vegetable system, and you have a little publication on each of your tables. Some of the tables are empty, so you might want to grab one from those empty tables if you're fighting over it at your table, but I can also send it to you. And there has been some research. I actually went to a really great presentation from in Canada, and I think you should invite Kristen Landry next year. I'm going to send you that name. She's done a lot of research on the synchrony of green manure nitrogen release to the corn, and then she did quite a bit of cut and carry. So cut and carry, you're growing your green manure in a field, and you're transporting it to your cornfield in order to fertilize it. So instead of growing it in place and having only one option in terms of when you're going to apply it, you can apply it kind of whenever you want. And she's done quite a bunch of research on it, and she's seen a great improvement from cutting it from another field, carrying it, applying it timely, versus just growing it in the field, terminating it when you have to terminate it. So I think, logistically, it sounds a little complicated to just move a lot of alfalfa around your farm, or clover, or whichever type of green manure you might be using, but I think it could still be very beneficial to look into, I mean, if you're hauling manure, it's also a lot of materials. And that publication that I put on the table is, I can't remember for which, maybe the Netherlands, it's from Europe, but it's written in English, and they've done it on large scale, so they've kind of done it with the equipment that's needed for that. Those were my closing comments.
Awesome. Okay.
Thank you very much for your attention and questions.
Thank you, Léa. Are there any other wrap-up questions for Léa? And you'll be at the Rodale booth. for more.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, okay.
You had that chart of manure availability and how quickly you should incorporate. How does precipitation affect, I mean, we're somewhat limited. I mean, I try to compost on our alfalfa fields, but chicken manure is so fine, so easily spreadable, so,
Yeah.
has so many of the nutrients that alfalfa needs. I always try to apply it before rain. We're not incorporating it. How much does rain affect the percolation of the nutrients into the soil?
Yeah. If it's not wet and it stays dry for a while, it's definitely not going to be available as quickly, probably. Yeah.
Well, will I lose as much nitrogen?
To volatilization. Great question. Would you lose as much nitrogen through volatilization if you apply poultry manure on a dry field?
Or how much do I preserve if it
Yeah.
rains after?
If it rains, it's going to go into your soil, and pelletized poultry manure is pretty readily available.
Mine would be raw, but.
Raw, okay. Great question.
I think
Yeah.
the principal issue with these nitrogen losses are from ammonia associated with fresh manure.
Mhm.
So you will lose some as the rain hits your poultry manure, but it's not going to be like putting down fresh manure where you've got a lot of ammonia in the solution that's going on the field, because that's just nitrogen that's going to go from the air.
And yeah, I also read, as I was preparing this, a good study, again from Canada. They were doing a lot of stuff, good stuff there. Unfortunately for you, they speak French, which is a problem for some of you here, I guess. But yeah, they did a good study on the pelletized poultry manure, but you said you're not using pelletized. Okay, but I can still send you that if you're interested.
I'm just worried I'm losing a lot of my nitrogen.
Mm-hmm.
How I can't incorporate it, but the rain supposedly, in my mind, helps
Yes,
move the nitrogen into
Yes.
the soil.
absolutely.
What would happen if I had 5 days of sun after I
Is it
applied
going to volatilize? I don't have the answer to that. I'm happy to look into it because I think it's a great question.
Mark, another. Jared?
On cover crops, how much can we shift the release? Or you talked about legumes 20 days, grasses 40 days. How much can we shift that by reducing particle size, like using a flail mower and whatnot, and making those things readily digestible? I guess I come back to kind of one of the guys, Gary McDonald, that keeps talking about this infield sheet composting and sizing particles. And the further
Yes.
north you go, the more important it is to size it even finer because we're running out of season. Any thoughts on how that would integrate into this?
Yeah, my thought is that, of course, if the particles are larger, then the nitrogen release is not going to be as quick as if you have smaller particles. And same if you're like in an organic no-till soybean system where your rye mat is on top of the ground, the less amount of soil to biomass contact, the slower the nitrogen release would be. But again, then it comes down to feasibility. If you have such huge residues, how do you proceed with your weed control in such a system? But yeah, agreed. It would slow the nitrogen release if your residues were larger than smaller.
So out of that 20 days, could we take out
How many days?
5 or 10 if we used a flail?
That's a great question.
Instead of, I mean, a lot of people are using high-speed discs,
Mhm.
trying to just take 3-foot material and put
Yes.
it in the ground, and I'm not sure we're not doing a disservice, right, by not taking that time-consuming and fuel-consuming step of flail mowing.
It's again a great, I mean, it's very complicated. Like there, as I showed, like a bunch of studies out there that are showing how long it takes for that nitrogen to be available, but it's very hard to replicate. And again, a lot of the studies were conducted in labs. It's really hard to track that in the field, so there is very little information, and I don't think it will ever be a very exact science. As far as how many days you're gaining by making your residues larger, like, I don't have a good answer to that. I would just make up a number, but I don't want to do that.
Leah, first of all, I think you can give Gary Zimmer a run for his money for a 20-minute soil test tutorial, so well done. I think you beat him. On alfalfa, I know you love alfalfa.
Slower, say that slower.
You did a good job on the soil test breakdown.
Okay.
I think you can beat Gary. But my question is this, so I know you love alfalfa, we've talked about this a lot. If you're willing to do one extra year on that cover crop, so the frost-seeded legume I put down in 23, I let that grow until spring of 25, 24 months. Is it worth the extra money to make that up mostly alfalfa, or can I stick with the medium red clover? I know alfalfa in year 3 and beyond beats it because the clover starts to die out, but it's also way more expensive and I can't grow the seed myself.
So you're thinking like looking at this rotation, where you're like underseeded with your wheat?
1 year after the small grain comes out, I'll let that clover stand. No doubt it has more, but is it worth swapping that for alfalfa?
I don't think so, because the seed is just so much more expensive than alfalfa, and I don't have, a specific answer with, it's hard to like have, it's a question that I've had for a long time. Can we run on those rotation versus the same with 3 years of alfalfa? My gut tells me I think so. The scientist in me is like, you don't have the data to say that, so I don't know.
All right, we should wrap things up. Let's thank Léa.